Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Global Politics. I am Dr. Krisluk. My normal co-host, Dr. Detsy's been out for a couple weeks with some other engagements, but I did want to make a video today about Russia and something that I've heard on and off over the past couple weeks that I think we should have a discussion about. So I was watching a couple different streamers, a couple different independent news sources. And I oftentimes will read and listen to a wide variety of sources because I think it's important to understand these perspectives. It's a better way to teach, a better way to understand competing narratives. But one narrative I heard, and something I heard was about Vladimir Putin and that he was good for the Russian economy. This particular streamer, one particular streamer in particular, really caught my attention. Made a comment about how great Vladimir Putin was for the Russian economy, really from 2000 to 2008. And this is something I've heard from a few different streamers, like I said, but this one really caught my attention because he's such our large streamer. Millions of followers, a pretty well-watched streamer. So I just wanted to make a video kind of talking about digging a little deeper into this claim. So one of the most misleading claims that I hear about Vladimir Putin is that he has been great for the Russian economy. And there is maybe a small piece of truth there, but it does draw the wrong conclusions from it. So we know that Russia did grow. The economy did grow very quickly during the first decade of Vladimir Putin's rule, especially from about 2000 to 2008, leading up to the global financial crisis. A better question, though, that we should ask ourselves is not did the economy grow. We know the economy grew. We can look at data. We can look at GDP per person. We can look at GDP growth. We know the economy grew. But there is a more important question we should ask, and that is why did the economy grow? Was it this fantastic public policy that Putin put out there that grew the economy? And we should also ask who benefited from that growth, and was that growth a durable model for economic development? So we know just from the outset, yes, the Russian economy grew from 2000 to 2008, leading up to the global financial crisis. But what we're going to talk about is that growth was not equal across the board. And so, when we think about what type of country Vladimir Putin took over when he became president, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, we know the Russian economy was in a bad place. We know that Russians coming out of the Soviet Union lost savings. We know nationally the country had a lot of debt. So we know the situation was pretty dire. This really culminated in 1998 when there's a financial crisis that the ruble collapsed. So the situation was bad in the early 90s, had started on an upward trajectory up until 1998. The ruble crisis actually kind of in a way helped prepare Vladimir Putin to do well because it devalued the ruble, it devalued the currency, it made the industrial might of post-Soviet Russia competitive around the world. But okay, so when we think of Putin comes to power in 2000, how did he achieve that growth? Putin's early economic success, though, was heavily tied to oil and gas. Again, not this master stroke of public policy that Vladimir Putin figured out how to save the Russian economy. It was natural gas and oil. So when we think of what maybe Putin did, he did do some tax reform. Scholars don't say, okay, nothing Putin did mattered. There were some tax reforms. We know that taxes were terribly difficult to collect in Russia in the 90s. So instead of progressive tax system like we have in the U.S. or many other Western democracies, Russia implemented a flat tax. A flat tax is much easier to collect, much easier for authorities to collect. So there was tax reform. There was, at the federal level, more fiscal discipline. The state did pay down debt. The government built reserves, which did matter in 2008 and 2009. And scholars do point to this saving for a rainy day as being a good strategy, a good public policy, because as the global financial crisis hit Russia, the Kremlin was able to subsidize and keep the economy afloat because of money that they saved. And so these are good macroeconomic public policy. But that growth wasn't from simply, again, these masterful public policies. These choices weren't irrelevant. Scholars don't say, oh, these were just wasteful. But they were not the fundamental source of Russia's economic growth. They helped manage the windfall of more money coming into the economy, but they did not create that windfall. So as the economy was growing at like 7% per year, over half of that growth can be attributed directly to oil price growth. Reforms, post-crisis recovering from the ruble crisis of 1998, did play a role, but over half, or at least half of that growth was from the increase in natural resource prices. And so Russia, which has a ton of these resources, had this windfall. So that is a more precise way or a more full way of looking at the Russian economy that did indeed do very well under the first half of Putin's government time in office. But it wasn't simply because Putin was this master orator of the economy. He kind of got lucky. There was a ton of growth in something that Russia naturally had a lot of. So the key point here is that Putin benefited from conditions that made the Russian state look more competent than it actually was. Rising energy prices filled the budget. They allowed the state to pay salaries, to pay pensions more reliably. They made it possible to rebuild foreign currency reserves. These rises in natural gas and oil allowed an increase in Russian consumption. They helped support increase in living. So something else that is important to think about. So when someone says, oh, Vladimir Putin did such a good job of growing the Russian economy, I've heard this in times from commentators who are seemingly very critical of maybe free market capitalism or American-style capitalism, or even neoliberalism, they say, well, an alternative growth model could be, well, what the Russians did. And so, okay, let's think about what that growth actually looked like in Russia. So I know I have it behind me, but there's a good book called Moscow is Not Russia. And so this does lead me to my second major point. Russia is not the same as Moscow. Moscow is not Russia. One of the biggest mistakes that people think of is to look at Moscow or maybe look at St. Petersburg and assume they are seeing Russia as a whole. Moscow is wealthy, globalized, heavily subsidized, politically central, and full of state-linked economic resources and activity. So Moscow is where federal money, corporate headquarters, elite universities, major media institutions, cultural institutions, and the political power are concentrated. St. Petersburg, while different than Moscow, is also a major city with significant infrastructure, visibility, the cultural capital of Russia. But these two cities, which again, as the economy was growing, and you can read accounts of people who went to Moscow during the late stages of the Soviet Union, where the buildings were kind of drab and concrete and the brutalist architecture. And then they went 2 decades later, or even a decade later, and they tell stories about how Moscow looks so different today than it did just 10, 20 years ago. As that oil money was pouring into, as that natural resource money was pouring into what are sometimes called the two capitals of Russia. We know Moscow is the official capital, but St. Petersburg sometimes also considered a capital. So that money was pouring into Moscow and St. Petersburg. But when we look outside of these two cities, and we look at places like Chelyabinsk or Magnitogorsk, even a place like Nizhny Novgorod, they aren't the same as Moscow. When we look at wealth inequality between Moscow and the provinces, it's massive. Something called monotowns, which were originally built during the Stalin's first 5-year plan. So these industrial cities out in rural Russia. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed and throughout the 90s, these cities were kind of dying because the industry in those cities no longer could just sell to the Soviet bloc. Now they had to be globally competitive, and they simply weren't. So the infrastructure, the quality of life, the pollution of these cities it didn't benefit from that economic growth that we saw in Petersburg or in Moscow. So when we say, well, Putin was so great for the Russian economy, if you're in a place like Moscow, it might seem like the 2000 to 2008 complete transformation of the city. But in the rural areas, Magnitogorsk, again, Chelyabinsk, these industrial centers, Omsk, they didn't benefit from that same level of money and investment. So that's just an important thing to think about. When we look at data, sure, the first part of Vladimir Putin's governance did experience quick, rapid economic growth. Standard of living across the board did increase. But it was driven not by fantastic macroeconomic public policy. Again, we saw some good policy, some smart policy. Some of the leading economists in the Russian government today are still very good economists. that sometimes push back against Vladimir Putin's public policy today in 2026. But a lot of the economic growth was driven by an increase in the price of oil and gas. Moreover, when we think about, well, who really benefited from this growth? Moscow, Petersburg became modern, cosmopolitan cities, whereas hundreds of cities across the former Soviet Union and within Russia were kind of left behind. Their industrial capacity declined. Their citizens suffered. So when we think about, okay, well, who really benefited? Sure, there were state subsidies from Moscow to these regions, and a whole different discussion about why. One of the reasons was to stop people from rising up and getting too mad. But setting all of that aside, we see that the growth didn't impact everyone the same. So I know this was kind of a rambling, all over the place video. It's just something that I've been thinking about over the past couple weeks. When people are sometimes critical of the U.S. economic system, they start to look at other systems. And one thing I've seen is they will look towards a country like Russia and Vladimir Putin and say, oh, look, there have been economic growth. But when we take a step back and think, okay, well, where did this economic growth come from? It hasn't been through fantastic public policy. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to make a video about and to think about. Thank you.